Good morning and welcome to the BCO's Research Launch, Thoughts on Washroom Design and Operation Post-COVID. I think we've still got a few participants joining, but we seem to have quite a good amount of people online now. The briefing note is part of a series of notes which examine the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the office design. My name is Claire Danahay and I will be chairing today's discussion. I am an interior designer and workplace consultant and a member of the Northern Regional BCO Committee and the Technical Affairs Committee. I would like to introduce you to our panellists, starting with Neil Pennell, Head of Design and Innovation and Property Solutions at Landsec. Neil is also Chair of the BCO Technical Affairs Committee and an editor of the BCO Guide to Specification. Megan Royston is Principal at Adamson's Associates International Limited. She is a member of the British Council of Officers Technical Affairs Committee, a key contributor to the BCO Guide to Specification, and the author of this briefing note. Peter Williams is Stanhope's in-house technical affairs advisor. He is member of the British Council of Officers Technical Affairs Committee and co-editor of the BCO's Guide to Specification and the Guide to Fit Out. The format for today will be an initial presentation by Megan on the briefing note, followed by a debate and discussion between our panellists and ending with a further Q&A. Please do ask questions through the session, however, via the Q&A tab. And I will hand over to Megan.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. The briefing note that Claire has mentioned will be available on the BCO website today and is available to members and non-members. When Neil asked me to prepare this paper, I thought that there would be a raft of guidance and recommendations to follow. After months of searching, I was surprised to note that there isn't any, even internationally. Washrooms are the most frequently visited spaces within an office building. They are internal spaces that contain all of the recognized contamination routes of COVID-19, contact, airborne, and fecal oral. Given this, it's really surprising that there's very little guidance available to landlords on adjustments to existing facilities and to designers, clients, managers for new developments. This briefing note presents the BCO's recommendations on how existing washroom layouts can be adapted and operated to minimize the risk of transmitting infection and considers what changes may be needed as we start to reimagine the design of future office spaces in a post-pandemic world. We have considered the challenges to washroom design in the current COVID-19 pandemic and in trying to follow government guidance to make space. There is a discussion point on traditional type gender split washroom layouts using BS 6465 Part 1 separation distances, which of course fall short of the minimum 1 meter separation guidance, with some developers acknowledging that there will be a reduction in attendance during the pandemic that enables them to tape off the intermediate wash basins and toilet stalls to encourage social distancing. We've also researched the reduction of touch points throughout the washroom, reviewing the whole journey of experience in using the washrooms. This starts at the entry, which is typically a vestibuled arrangement, through to the operation of toilet stalls, washing and drying hands to the exit arrangement. With the increase of cycling to work as a general trend, exacerbated by people's fear of using the underground during the pandemic, we felt that we had to review shower and locker facilities. When most gym and golf clubs reopened the last time, they closed off the shower areas, encouraging people to shower at home. Of course, in an office environment, this is not possible, so we need to be creative in how we manage these areas. We have suggested steps to reduce the contamination in these areas, including managed attendance, increase in social distancing where possible, the introduction of one-way system if possible, frequent cleaning, providing dedicated lockers, and to providing full height shower facilities. There is a section in the paper on our recommendation to existing washroom facilities, highlighting that as people return to work, there needs to be a visible change to the washroom to give users the reassurance that the office environment has changed to provide a safer environment during the pandemic. This could provide us all with opportunities to reimagine these spaces. Some suggested measures include reducing touching points where possible, investing in foot-operated openers that could be fitted to doors to reduce contact, installing motion sensor taps, soap and towel dispensers, and touch-free toilet and urinal flushing if not already in place. Extending toilet cubicle partitions to full height of the existing ventilation system can accommodate this, permanently increasing the washroom extract rates by enhancing the washroom ventilation systems, installing a dedicated fresh air supply if practicable, and applying antimicrobial and vercidal surface coatings to support traditional cleaning regimes. We have a large section on new washroom design, touching on layout, ventilation, material, and product selection. We note that we do not believe that there should be a re-examination of the number of fixtures and fittings within the spaces, but that the layout and arrangements of these spaces should be considered. Within the layout section of the note, there's a comparison study between superloos and traditional gender split layouts, with the merits of superloos being reviewed, even though these take slightly more space. We've all read that good ventilation is a key consideration in our fight against transmission of the virus. Supply air to washrooms has typically been as air leakage from the adjacent office space, with mechanical extract above each cubicle. Understanding the importance of clean air, the paper notes that dedicated supply and extract may be per new washroom design. Material selection and product selection that can aid in maintaining hygiene levels are discussed in the paper. A list of suggested management measures have been included, and the paper rounds with a reminder of hand hygiene. At the end of the paper, there's a list of reference material for further reading that also shows where we have got most of our information from. And today we have a great team here that have all contributed to the paper, and I hope this allows us to have a healthy debate. And back to Claire, thanks.
Thank you, Megan. It's a very interesting summary of the paper. The first question I'd place to the panel is, in terms of an existing facility and how you might be able to improve and enhance what people already have, what do you think the top recommendations and list of priorities would be to improve any existing facilities?
I think Megan outlined some of those in a brief introduction. It's obviously things that you can do quickly. It's really important, I think, that to give people confidence when they return to the workplace that there are visible things that have happened to those spaces that will give them the confidence to use them without any significant risk of getting infected by COVID in that process. It's all about putting in place the sanitisation facilities. If you can start to introduce measures that reduce the number of touch points, it really maintaining social distancing within those constrained spaces is a challenge. So good signage. I know that management teams in the first return to work put in place many of the management measures that we talk about in the paper, but I think it's then really down to owners and operators of buildings to start to consider where they want to make some limited investment to really start to improve the facility in terms of reducing touch points and creating a better ventilated environment.
Thank you, Neil. Has anybody else got anything else they'd like to add to
Yeah,
that?
just to reinforce what Neil said, really, I think much of the interventions in the early stage, the first part of lockdown, were around management, and it's now a case of which of those management measures now need to become part of the long-term solution for toilets. And I guess some things like cleaning regimes and so on will flex depending upon whether we've got a pandemic or not. But with Neil, I suspect, I agree, I think there are probably going to be some measures which people will simply come to expect as the norm in toilets, and that will be particularly around the touch points, I think, perhaps more than anything else, and maybe selection of surfaces. What does the toilet look like? So I think the washroom is going to become a place that people want to experience as clean or perceive as being clean when they walk through the door. And maybe you'd have something to say about that, Megan, about picking materials not just because of their potential bactericidal or virucidal properties, but also they're easy cleanable and they kind of look clean as well.
Yeah, there's been a lot of market research into this, and I think that the larger format tiles that are being marketed, there is a lot of new products that have new coatings on them that make them easier to clean, and we even touch on in the paper that there's toilets that are self-cleaning now, so those kind of things, and actually another thing was just trying to in writing the papers is trying to imagine how we all use the washrooms, right from as you approach. I was just saying to the panel the other day, when you enter the toilet, you get frustrated that you have to touch a surface or touch a door. You've washed your hands, and on the way out, you've got to open another door to get out, and there's no place to put to throw away a paper towel if that's what you've used. And it's trying to imagine in all of those scenarios how you would improve an existing facility. And that could just be as simple as, if you didn't prop open the door, putting a disposal for your napkin right at the end of the as you're exiting, so that you don't recontaminate your hands after you've already washed them. Or reimagining the space that you could have more kind of labyrinth approach to the toilet room. More difficult in existing conditions. Also, we have to consider how acoustically you separate between the office space and the toilets if you do remove the doors or prop them open. But I think all of those things you have to think about as these toilet rooms, as you're looking at existing toilet rooms.
Thank you, Megan. Moving on to how we might design new facilities, there are some diagrams within the paper which touch on the amount of space that might be allocated to the guidelines as they currently are, the single-sex occupancy versus the unisex superloos. Could we expand a little bit on the amount of space that might be dedicated and how that might impact on regulations? How do we transition from the regulations of how many male occupants we have to female occupants and single sex to unisex superloo configurations, and how many we provide?
I'll jump in there. So I think BS 6465 Part 1 shows us how we lay out the toilets, and it's given a lot of diagrams about spacing of urinal, spacing of wash basins. 6465 Part 2 is more about how many and how you calculate them. And when we've did a quick analysis of, and in the paper it shows there's a 900 square meter floor space using a 1 in 10 occupancy. And if you use gender split, you're using 60%, so you hold overall 120% of that occupation. And we looked at what that would give us compared to a superloo arrangement. Superloos, it does recommend that we use the 25% increase, because people will stay within the superloo and wash their hands, so they could spend longer in those areas. But when we looked at the arrangements, the current gender split is slightly smaller if you do a compact arrangement than the superloos, to give you the same number of facilities needed for to use that occupancy. So the numbers, I think, are sound in terms of how many you provide. I think what is different is in the traditional gender split, basins are only 700 apart, not your meter as a minimum recommendation by the government in these scenarios. And the urinals are 800. So when you're reimagining those spaces, we really should be thinking maybe the Part 1 needs to be re-examined in terms of the spacing, rather than the number of appliances. I think, Neil, you may have something to add on that.
Yeah, I think the illustration in the paper is just based on a sort of area of 900 square meters, as we've said, just to illustrate the differences and at different break points on the standards and the number of people that you're catering for. The areas will vary slightly, but it did show that the superloo would potentially take up a bit more area on a floor plate to give the same level of service provision, if you like. However, the advantages are clear in terms of less contact points. You have less communal space that you've got to deal with social distancing, and you can make the ventilation specific to each toilet as opposed to more communal ventilation of a sort of shared space. So there are measures that you can put in traditional toilet layouts to improve them as well, in terms of maybe introducing full height cubicles, providing better ventilation into the space, looking at the spacing of washhand basins and urinals where they're provided. All those things can be done. I think what we're saying is that people need to really start that debate now and start thinking about what do we do next in toilet provision in workplace, and how is the sort of learnings, if you like, that we've been through and the adaptations we've had to make in the short term to the toilet provision. Do we need to think a little bit differently going forward? Although hopefully quite soon we'll be able to start to move away from the restrictions that we've seen with COVID, as better and better news starts to emerge on the vaccine front. So maybe the tendency will be just to revert back to the old normal. But I think there's a big debate going on at the moment. I think we've seen such a imposition on our lives that we're going to be looking at a new normal going forward. People are much more aware of their health and well-being perspective of what's provided in a built environment space, and I suspect that it will be something that we all have to think about going forward as we design and develop new buildings, and as we refurbish existing ones, to look very closely at areas like the washroom facilities and other wet room spaces like showers and changing rooms, etc. Because these are spaces where people do come together in a confined space, indoors, spending time there or touching many points within that space, and transmission of any infection can happen in those sorts of circumstances. So I think the new normal going forward will require us to rethink how we design buildings from an overall perspective, but very specifically these areas I think need particular attention. Don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Peter?
Yeah, I think it's I'm not quite sure where I'm going to go with this, but I mean, it's a frequent, one of the most frequently visited parts of an office building. Pretty much everyone goes there during the course of a working day. It's essentially a private space, and again, I'm not sure where I'm going with this exactly, but there's a sense of vulnerability about, I was going to say, exposing yourself in a toilet. I might reword that, but going to the toilet is a pretty private, whether it be washing or using a WC, is a pretty private kind of thing, and it's I think there's going to be not just the measures that we're putting in place for which we can demonstrate evidence. Perhaps there's also this psychological aspect about making it absolutely clear to people that the room has been designed and is maintained with people's personal safety in mind.
Thank you. I've got a few questions that are just coming in, which I might share with you. I've got a question from Floyd, which says, can superloos be provided overall across gender on the whole building calculation? If so, they could be left badgeless for occupiers to label as it suits them.
Absolutely. There's no requirement that you have to have gender split toilets. We're finding that generally that's a tenant-driven or an occupancy-driven requirement. So a tenant might prefer to have gender split. I know there's this going into, like Peter, going into a bit of sensitive debate here. I know there's a lot of women that don't like to use toilets that males go to. And that if you go all superloos, you're going against men using urinals, because of course we can't put urinals into superloo spaces. However, I do think it gives you so much more flexibility in being able to badge the superloos however you want them to be. So you could still do them that they're all unisex. You could do them that they're male, female, or gender neutral signs on the doors, and you can do that throughout the building and give the tenant the ability to assign how they want.
Thanks, Megan. That's great. Gordon has said in the commercial facilities will in commercial facilities will be controlled to avoid more people than should be inside the toilet. So I suppose it's kind of how we're actually ensuring the occupancy of these spaces are being used properly.
I think there's probably an opportunity for some technology here, and I think there's brief mention of it in the paper. About, you know, we sense occupancy anyway, and it's perhaps easy with superloos because we've probably got lights with occupancy sensors. So it ought to be pretty straightforward to show, you know, which toilets are free, which toilet blocks are fully occupied. I suppose it could go as far as some sort of smart multi-story car parks and steer you to a space. But I suspect it's at the very least it might be a case of saying, you know, this toilet here is 70% in use to let you know that there are facilities available. Neil?
Yeah, I agree. I think it is an opportunity for smart building technologies probably to look at some form of sensors that give you the level of use within a toilet facility. That could be then displayed locally, or where perhaps people have a building app in place. It may also give people access to information that way. So at least, you know, we see this now on lots of things in our daily lives. We get indications of how busy shops are at certain periods, how busy public transport is. So you can sort of plan your journey as it were. Although maybe a visit to the toilet might be more pressing at times. But at least you know before you get there if you're going to be in a situation where you've got to wait outside, or when you go inside, you're going to be in a confined space potentially with other people waiting to use the facilities. So I think all those things are possible. I'm sure that those things are already emerging into the marketplace, and people are doing those things. So to give people that information that they need, and to give management a degree of control over the use of the toilet facilities. Also, that information can be used to give prompts for people to do cleaning exercises. You know, if the toilet's been heavily used, then you can match the cleaning regime to its overall use during the day. So there's lots of benefits that we can start to leverage in, if you like, from using that sort of smart approach.
And I think actually it's really important in shower areas. So, you know, if there's a lot of cyclists that have arrived relatively close to each other, and you don't want them queuing to use the shower facilities. I think it's really important that smart technology starts coming into that. So you can track how many people are coming in, how many are in the space. Of course, all done very privately. So you're just monitoring the flow of people in and out. But that, I think, is really important. We don't want to have people queuing to use facilities. So that needs to be managed in a very good and clear way. And I think the use of technology is increasing a lot, but it's never. We need to be using it in a very imaginative way now to steer people in the right direction.
Thank you. Philippa has asked, when you're calculating superloos, would you still use a 50-50 split, or would you run the risk of it being inappropriately balanced if tenants are left to rebadge the WCs on their own, and you might not end up with the traditional 60-60?
That's a very good question. So traditionally, the way we calculate superloos is on the 100% occupancy, not on 120%. So you wouldn't do the 60-60 split. The 60-60 split allows you to kind of increase male and female as you will, if that makes sense. So when you don't know the original occupancy of how you're going to occupy that floor. Typically, that's how we would calculate the toilet. So we would go 100% for superloos, and then we would do but we have to add the 25%, which I think would give you enough flexibility to then be able to also have that gender split moving beyond the 50-50% if needs be.
Excellent, thank you. Moving back to the technology, Lauren has asked, do you think there's a place for blue light anti-back lighting in washrooms? There doesn't seem to have been much data available to support the evidence of it.
Definitely that's one for Neil.
Well, yeah, and potentially Peter, I'm sure he'll have a view. I mean, there is obviously evidence to show that UVC germicidal irradiation using UV lighting can obviously kill bacteria and viruses. So I think in terms of its efficacy in actually dealing with virus infection, there is clear research evidence to show that. I think the challenge here is deploying that sort of technology in a public space, because that UVC light to enable it to do what it needs to do to actually disinfect a space, it needs to be on a certain level of intensity for a certain period of time. Also, that type of UV light can damage people's eyes. It can also long-term exposure to UV light has got issues as well. So you have to be very careful, I think, using that type of approach to sterilize spaces. I think you may have seen, and I think Heathrow Airport, amongst others, have invested in little robots with UV lights that move around spaces, but they're sent around those spaces during periods when the areas that they're dealing with are unoccupied and it's strictly controlled. I think having lights that just come on in a toilet space to ensure that that happens when people are not in those spaces is probably the biggest challenge. I don't know if you've got a view on that as well, Peter. I think you're on mute.
So I do. I just have a mental image of a sixth form disco where you could find out very rapidly who had dandruff. I think that there is evidence that quite a few of the measures that are proposed work, but they work in limited circumstances. And our challenge is finding out all the time how are they applied to offices and the way that people use them. I think we're going to see a lot more about UV light, but perhaps disinfecting spaces when people are not there. I think there's probably a picture in the paper as well of a toilet bluing in a kind of UFO-like blue way, and that's a picture of I think it's a Japanese toilet which has UV sterilization built into it. And clearly that could work. But I guess what we want to see in the way of evidence is how effective is it? Does it work for the short times that we're able to deploy it? And then we've got to think about what are the downsides for it. So cost is one thing, but there's the carbon emissions associated with making it, installing it, and maintaining it as well. So it's quite easy, I think, to react in a kind of knee-jerk way and say we could get some benefit from these things, but we need to think about how they play out over time and the implications of that.
Thank you. Roddy asked an earlier question of could we clarify the 9 square metre measure that was discussed? Is that a standard for each toilet provision or for a person?
I think the study that we did was it's for a 900 square meter floor plate, NIA floor plate. We used that as just a generic floor plate and said, well, if we use that, what occupancy could, or what toilet facilities would we need to do between gender and between Superloo, using the British Standard guidance for calculation. So it wasn't, I don't know quite where the 9 square meters has come from, but I think it means that we used 900 square meters just as a typical comparator to say, well, how much space would it take to do the Superloos compared to the gender split? Now, one thing we did look at was, yes, Superloos take the number that you would need takes more space than if you used the number you would need for gender split, traditional gender split. But if you start looking at how you might increase the distancing of those facilities, so you increase the wash basins, maybe you have full height partitions, that then starts to make your gender split toilet larger, which gets it much closer then to the kind of same size layout that you would need for Superloos.
Yeah, I think
I don't know if I've answered that question. I don't know if I understood it correctly, but
yeah.
yeah.
I was
Sorry,
just
Neil.
going to say, I think maybe they misheard. The 900 square meters was just sort of a typical floor in an office building. I think we just used a 1 person per 10 square meter occupancy just to give us a 90-person requirement, if you like, and then looked at that in terms of the British standard recommendations. What would that lead to a toilet design? And as I said earlier, as you look at different sizes of floor plates, different occupancy densities, you'll get slightly different answers. But I think ultimately there'll always be, if you like, a space penalty to pay with the Superloop provision when you factor in the additional recommendation of the BS to cater for that increased dwell time in that type of toilet, and to give you that future flexibility, as Megan pointed out. If you did want to sex the toilets later, it would also give you that flexibility as well, to some degree mirroring, if you like, the provision that you put in place in gender specific toilets. So it was just a worked example, just to show an illustration, if you like, of how you would respond to provide a solution using the recommendations in the BS, and then trying to sort of draw conclusions from that around, what the challenges would be and the advantages around deploying one or other of the solutions within a building.
Thank you. David has asked a couple of questions which are quite interesting. Is there any opportunity for the space of a Superloo to be flexible? So, for example, you might have a under normal circumstances arrangement and then a pandemic version where the facilities might be able to go up and down in terms of their usage. I assume that what's meant, and what would the economics or costs be from the change to the new norm? So if we no longer install what we've been installing over the past years but go to Superloos, is there any significant cost increase?
Yes, there's bound to be a cost increase with it. I mean, we've just had a conversation about how much net space might be taken, and I think we're in a pandemic mode. Perhaps they're pretty much neutral, but building Superloos is my view anyway, is going to cost more than building conventional loos. And there's some other questions that come up then, say in a conventional toilet, what one does about drying your hands. So you can put in a range of basins, a range of toilet cubicles, and it could be maybe a couple of hand dryers or a couple of towel dispensers. But for instance, with Superloos, then you probably put those facilities in each one. And if you've got a 100, 150 Superloos about the building, and we're talking about, would we genuinely put in 150 hand dryers? I don't know. I suspect not. Neil, your views on that?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a choice that will be made by people that are developing buildings as to what the perceived market preferences, and whether there's an advantage in having one provision type or another in your building. Both meet the requirements, both provide the service that's required in accordance with the standards. There are just, some people prefer the provision of Superloos, others prefer more traditional toilets. So it's been a debate anyway, I think, in the industry in the last few years, alongside, the trend towards general neutral facilities within buildings, etc. So I think all of those things were already in play. What we have here, I think, is, if you like, an extra push to our thinking from the experience that we've been through with COVID, and the focus on health and well-being, and the importance that these particular spaces play in the day-to-day use of buildings, and in ensuring people's are kept in an environment where the transmission of any infection is minimized. We look to certify buildings now based on their health and well-being credentials. So I think what we're not saying here is one is right and one is wrong. What we're saying is, I think people need to consider in both instances the learnings that we've been through, the expectations that people will have going forward, and what we can do to make both types of facility better. And then individual developers and operators, owners of buildings can make the decisions around what particular type of provision, or even a mixture of those provisions, could be provided in buildings. That is down to, I think, individual developers to decide when they're creating new buildings, and owners when they're reconfiguring their existing ones. But I think in either case, you need to sort of consider making these spaces as secure as they can be from a position of transferring infections, and making them attractive spaces for people to use. And as we know, it's when you talk about selling your home, it's all about the kitchen and the bathroom that sells homes. Well, it's the same to some degree in office buildings. Always talked about that. The loos, the lifts, and the reception are all key to that sort of user journey, if you like, and it's what people use every day in buildings. And all of those things we've talked about in our earlier papers. I think a touchless experience, a frictionless experience through the process of using a building, and having the confidence that your health and well-being is being looked after by the people that are providing you with those facilities. And I think that occupiers and customers of office space will expect those provisions to be in place, whatever type of toilet facility is provided. And in new buildings will probably demand more of the industry to provide spaces that are suitable for a future world, where we've now come through a process that's made us look at it perhaps with different eyes.
Thank you, Neil. Alison has made an interesting point that there's quite a lot of research around the fact that copper is an effective means to deal with infection control on surfaces. Is there likely to be a recommendation towards ironmongery and sanitary equipment with high copper content as a suitable alternative for infection control?
The paper does touch on the research papers that have come out pandemic, showing how long the virus stays on different surfaces. Of course, copper is, as a lot of people know now, is I believe it's 3 hours that it stays on copper. So we have to think that yes, those kind of things can assist. But we have to think long term of maintenance. How's copper going to look after a while, after a lot of use? But also generally, the toilets, washrooms are used as this quite frequently, and certainly people are going in and out more than every 3 hours. So yes, these products can help. However, nothing's going to replace the kind of frequent cleaning regime that needs to be in place with that. But also then we have to look, if everybody now starts saying, well, now we want copper push plates, copper ironmongery throughout, how is that going to affect the market? Is that going to be available? I think there's a longer term look at how, yes, it's effective, but is everybody going to go that way, and how is the long-term cost of maintenance going to work with it? Peter, I think you have a view on this too.
Yeah, I think it's as you say, there may be longer term benefits. Say overnight things might die off because of the effect of materials. One of the interesting things that we're seeing is not so much about the antimicrobial impacts of materials, or that there are loads available. I've seen from lift manufacturers, handrail manufacturers, any number of people are touting these things. But a concern we have is about the durability of finishes, irrespective of whether or not they claim to be antimicrobial. And in that, because we're introducing regular, frequent cleaning, and some of the chemicals used are relatively aggressive, is how well do these materials last anyway under the normal cleaning regime? So again, back to a point I made a little while ago, it's not just about, is there something now that's being talked about? How does that play out when we apply it in a real life situation? And I think that's going to be one of the big issues for materials, that perhaps some of the materials we like at the moment, because of their texture, their appearance or whatever, are going to be quite difficult to cope with cleaning aggressively and frequently over a long period.
Yeah, I think the research report said that it was a 4-hour period, and then virtually there was no trace of infection left on a copper surface. I think whether you use those materials or not, it depends on what value you see in using them. As Peter said, I think the more important thing here is that what the paper's trying to do, I guess, is to get people to think much more clearly about the type of materials they're using, the design of the spaces, how easy are they to clean, how robust are the finishes to that more frequent cleaning regime, are there benefits in having antiviral, antimicrobial finishes or inherent properties within some of the materials in these types of spaces. I think all of those things need to be thought through. I think design teams need to really look hard at what the choice of materials are in these spaces, and going forward, think just beyond just perhaps the basic hygiene level, but also to think about the implications of the materials that they choose long term on the operation and security and resilience of those spaces.
Thank you. Mike's made a couple of interesting comments. We've got this first comment is urinals aren't used at home, so is it time to move on and remove them from the workplace, which is potentially a very valid comment, coming from a female, that is. And also, should we be rethinking the use of hand dryers at the risk of airborne contaminants and paper towels being more relevant moving forward?
Wow, there's an interesting topic and much debate. I think at the early start of lockdown, there was some recommendations kicking about suggesting that hand dryers shouldn't be used on the basis that it could be dispersing droplets through the air. But I think subsequently that has been found not to be the case. People have cleaned their hands typically before they use a hand dryer, so there's an element of disinfection that's taken place just because they've gone through that. So I think at the moment, formally, the jury is out. Although interestingly, the well building standard promotes the use of hand towels because they're better at removing potentially infectious materials from the hands because there's mechanical action at the end of it. So as I recall, we don't make a recommendation one way or the other because at the moment, as I say, the jury is out.
Yeah, I think we did have a long debate about this, and I think although the well standards do suggest that you have to have paper towels, it doesn't exclude you from having hand dryers. So majority of washrooms that we're designing at the moment have the ability to have both. So the choice is up to the individual. But it is worth noting we did a lot of research on this to try and find if there was a risk to airborne, the hand dryers exacerbating kind of airborne contaminants. And there just simply isn't. The amount of air that blows out of the hand dryers is so small that there's no evidence to show that it actually contributes to the contamination within the toilet rooms themselves.
Thank you, that's really interesting. Simon just has a quick question of, can the male-female split be reduced to 50-50 if the additional uplift of WCs was increased with a gender-neutral facility?
Another really interesting question. Put me on the spot a little bit. I'm not 100% sure that that we could do that. Although I think that's a debate we have to have on a case-by-case basis with local authority. There's no specific guidance that I can think of within the code that says we would just do the 100% rather than the 60-60 split, and how that would work with gender neutral. But I think that debate should happen because there is nothing that's recorded for that at the moment that I can think of.
Thank you. For a very interesting point from David, going back to the paper towel versus hand dryers argument. Paper towels are wasteful and unsustainable. Many tenants want them, but we try to minimise their use, preferring hand dryers. What are the BCO's thoughts on sustainability versus wellness?
I think I've seen papers debating that both ways as well, where there's obviously with the electric hand dryers there's an energy use component to that versus the, you can recycle paper or you can get paper from sustainable sources. So there are arguments both ways on the environmental side as well as on the health side. Hence, we've sort of said both are suitable for use and can do the requirements, if you like, but it's really down to the operators of buildings and the designers of buildings to really make the choices, or maybe offer both solutions in a space, and then people themselves can make a choice.
Thank you, Neil. So we're coming up to nearly 10 to. So if anybody else has got any questions they'd like to add to the panel, please pass them on. And in the meantime, is there a hierarchy of actions that you think people should take away from this paper as the priorities of what they could do either with existing or when designing new spaces? Maybe a top 3 from each of you.
It's probably likely to be similar things, I guess. For me, it's about minimizing the touch points. It's about providing good ventilation in the space, because we know that there are significant links in poorly ventilated indoor spaces with high spreading events, if you like, for the virus. So I think those are my 2 starting points. And the third is, to obviously make sure that the cleaning of the toilets and all the things that you need to put in place to make that as straightforward and easy as possible is part of the design and thinking behind how those spaces are put together, so that we can make them suitable for the type of use they're going to see, and it can be done in a cost-effective and speedy manner.
I guess right now, my top 3 are the same as Neil's, but perhaps in a slightly different order. I think the frequent clean is probably top of the current list, as a way of keeping existing buildings free of contamination. And then I'd go, like Neil, I'd go down the touch-free, try and minimise those contact points as much as possible, and definitely the improvement of ventilation, ideally, and as we're doing with our new developments, with a dedicated fresh air supply into the toilet as well, to make sure that it's fresh air that's passing through the room rather than air that's already been used in an office space.
Perhaps I should have said in no particular order.
Yeah.
And I would echo those 3 elements. I think, but I also think, as architects and as an architect myself, I think it's thinking about how we can reimagine the spaces to make them. I read a really interesting article the other day about the Americans call the washrooms restrooms, and they used to be typically spaces that you went and you rested, and socially you had a little bit more psychological break during your day to go to the restroom, and there used to be sofas and things. And I'm not suggesting we go down that route, but it's that we need to think about those spaces as not being the dirty old toilet room, that they are an integral part of everyday use in the office. Everybody uses it during the day. Don't make it the horrible little space, and don't just design it against COVID, design it as with people in mind and with our use in mind. And I think rather than echoing the 3 things, those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Some really interesting points there. We've had a question come in from Malcolm. What do people think about touch-free taps? 1 in 6 always seems not to be working, and they obviously need frequent battery changes.
Well, have you ever played the game about what if you had a superpower, what would it be? I think I've got one. I seem to be invisible to sensor taps and hand dryers, so I feel your pain with this one. I think there are 2 things. One is about picking the equipment, making sure that the stuff you buy is reliable. There are cheap sensor taps, there are expensive sensor taps, and so I think there's one, and Neil probably has the same experience of over time finding out which ones work better than the others. But it's also a comment on many of the other technological aspects we've talked about. all these things come at a price, and I don't mean just the initial cost, but they need maintenance and they need repair. So there's a little bit of just getting used to the idea that as we put more complication into a washroom, we'll all learn what works better than in terms of manufacturers and suppliers and others, but we also just need to be prepared to stay on top of maintenance.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, ultimately though, you know, washrooms, at least there are always hand cleansing facilities provided. So if people don't have touch-free elements, you know, you still have the opportunity to clean your hands these days. And I think going forward, hand sanitizer will become a permanent fixture in the world of offices and other buildings, where people have the opportunity, obviously, to sanitize their hands at frequent intervals. But I just think that people do like to not to have to touch things as they go into a toilet space. So I think there is going to be pressure for this type of approach. In any case, it was already a trend, I think, in most modern building developments. You see touch-free facilities in public and in commercial office spaces. So as Peter said, you know, choose the right stuff, and you know, that will hopefully those problems will diminish going forward.
Thank you. Talking of touch-free then, the idea of moving away from doors going into the main WC facility, more like we're used to seeing in service stations, do you think that's something that might gradually filter into guidelines, and whether that would be considered acceptable?
I think it's challenging in an office environment because of the acoustic issues between toilet rooms being so close to the office layouts. I think there's a lot on the market at the moment and a lot of our clients are looking at the moment at doing door pulls or automatic doors as an alternative to just propping the doors open, just to overcome those acoustic issues. I think it's really looking at it on a case basis. So if you're the washrooms are located in such a place that they opening onto a different kind of environment rather than onto the office floor plate, then potentially a labyrinth kind of entrance could be looked at. But I think it's definitely a case by case that you could look at either a combination or you know, if you're stuck with a more traditional type toilet arrangement where you have a vestibule, then it's more like automated or door pull, relatively inexpensive door pulls fitted to the doors.
Thank you, Megan. Malcolm's just made the point as well that a lot of hospitals
Peter,
still
I
haven't...
don't know if you have anything to...
sorry, a lot of hospitals still have handles as standard for clinical hand wash basins, which are just operated by the elbow rather than them being pure hands-free sensor taps, which is an interesting point.
It is a really good point, and I suspect quite a bit of this has to do with fashion. Some of it's probably to do with ergonomics, because in hospitals often the basins are set at a different height, so it's easy to operate with an elbow. But there are foot operated taps, knee lever operated taps, all sorts of things like that. But I guess they're tend to be associated with healthcare facilities or food prep plants or something like that. So it's a really good point, and my guess would be that it's driven as much as anything by the style and the appearance of a range of basins.
So we've got 5 minutes left. Is there any other points that you guys feel would be worth making to share your thoughts on the paper before we close?
Only in passing, really, that I think with lots of the stuff that's going on during the pandemic now is there are many good ideas. What would be really interesting to do is a year down the road from now is to see how those ideas played out in practice. So, you know, how we quite get that together, I don't know. Perhaps it's surveys later on about asking some of the BCO membership and others about what did you do and how well did it work. But I think it's really important for us to gain some feedback so that we can give better advice in future about both what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, thank you. Some really good
Yeah.
points.
I'd echo that. I think that's a really good point to finish on, probably.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much for everybody to joining us and raising some really valid questions for our panel. And thank you ever so much for the panelists for answering them so well. The briefing note is available on the BCO website, and it's available to download free for all members and non-members. Just visit www.bco.org.uk. And thank you once again.